So currently in Photoshop, what we are going over is something called layer masks. But instead of going over all the different ways you can use that, we're going to start with this exercise here called gradient mask. That is just using a layer mask to do with particular things, so you can start to see sort of hands-on how it works. And if we click on the exercise that says gradient mask, you'll see there's two JPEGs, and then there's something called instructions. Now the instructions, they show actually how to do this with a procedurally generated gradient. So if we look, there we go, real close at this layer preview, it's basically you apply a gradient the same way you would to a rectangle of some sort in there, and you can see it switches from the one thing to the other. But of course it makes these trees really see-through, and also I prefer things to be a little bit more under control. So in order to, this is how you can set it up if you need something written. But what we're going to do is we're going to do this manually. Normally I might use a tablet for this, but I don't have enough USB ports. So to have the headset and a tablet in, so we're just going to have to do this manually with the mouse. So I'm going to save both these images, both the one that says London and the one that says Lake. And because I'm kind, these are both going to be exactly the same size. So when I go into Photoshop and I go to open them, there should be too many things. There we go. Lake and London. So dragging one into the other is going to be relatively simple. All right, so I'm going to take the London one, click, bring it over to this one, and it should snap. There we go. Those are telling me it's snapping there. Should snap to the middle. And I'm going to undo that fake lock, that JPEG lock on that layer, and I'm going to legit lock the lake layer, I think, for now. There's reasons to bring it back, but just not this second. And let us see. I want to make sure I'm doing this in the right order, so we're going to double check the instructions, which have us, yes, putting the city on top of the lake. So the reason why that matters is because we're applying a layer mask to the thing we're going to be sort of non-destructively erasing from, and we just need to make sure we're doing that to the correct thing. So what we're going to do is applying an actual layer mask is very simple. We select the layer, and then you can go down here to this button that looks like a square with a circle in it, or you can go up to the menu for the layers thing and say create clipping mask. Nope, I lied. Not create clipping mask. Somewhere in here is a thing for a layer. Oh, it doesn't have it in the panel. That's fascinating. I would assume that all of those buttons would be available in here, but they're not. So we have to press this button. And it creates, it's hard to see, but there's now two previews on this layer. The picture itself and this layer mask. Now, what's technically going on under the hood is that this is the color information now, and this is the alpha information now. And since the alpha information says it's all white, that means we show up, everything shows. But you can actually change which of these things you're affecting. So we want to make sure we're always on the layer mask thumbnail. If you click that, that's what you would affect. And I'll show you why by doing the wrong thing first. Let's say I want the lake to show through here instead of this city block. So I don't have a layer mask on, and I just start erasing, make my brush a little bit bigger. There we go. Oh, look at the lake. It's so pretty. Get rid of those bosses or whatever it is I'm trying to do. There you have it. And let's say I'm like, oh, I know there's trees here, and so I want to bring the trees in and kind of work with that. And you can see how actually I'm being really terrible and quick about this. And you can see, like, for example, the sky is now in front of the building, and that makes no sense. And I went too far over here, and it's like, oh, I need to get that back. How do I get that back? Well, if you've done a bunch of other things, you may not be able to get that back, right? Because what we technically did is we erased from here, right? It's destructive editing. There are a couple of tools in here that can get that back, but really, they're not always going to work. So we're going to undo, and we're going to put that layer mask back on. At least I hope Yeah, if you want to make sure that it undid all the way, you can actually make the layer underneath invisible. And if you don't see anything shift, it means that you're not seeing through to it. I'm going to click that layer mask, and I'm going to make sure I'm working on the layer mask, and then I'm going to, there we go, put it back to the default, and start erasing. And to our eyes, it looks like the exact same thing, but it's not. If you take a close look at the layers panel, you'll see that this is still intact. And what that means is that I can actually, on my eraser, I can trade these colors. I can switch the black and the white, and I can get the city back. That's the key thing with this layer mask, is that it's undoable exactly at that moment. There's no fancy brushes you have to use. There's nothing extra you have to do. It will just simply work. And I'm going to check to see, oh, the hardness is all the way down. Okay. And so now, as I'm going through here, I can pick and choose which stuff I want to show up and which stuff I don't. And this is not going to be a perfect composite by any stretch of the imagination, but if you pay attention to where the trees are, you can bring in those trees. And I'm overdoing it a little bit because I know I can get it back, right? So I can bring in these trees here, and I'm kind of half guessing at where they are. It's also because I've done this before. And if I go too far, like I clearly have here, you're clearly seeing too much of the sky here, right? That's all that blue stuff, this purple that's over here. So I'm going to go down to a much smaller brush. I'm going to switch my colors around. And I'm going to grab the city back. Right? We're going to grab that back. And then because my brush is really soft on the edges, the trees will still be transparent. It would work better if it was a larger brush, technically. The larger the brush, the sort of more the gradient of going from point A to point B. There we go. And then if I want to, I can always choke it back too far, switch it around again, and then slowly grab a little bit of that out. So you can trigger back and forth between erasing and bringing something in here. And like I said, it's not going to be a perfect composite. It's not meant to be. This is not the solution if you exactly wanted these things to blend together. But let me make sure I'm on the right brush here. It is a good way to get started. Or if you need to do something really quick, like if someone says, what would this look like together? You have 5 minutes, you know, because the client really needs this right now, or we don't have a large budget to put this composite together, then you could put something together that looks really nice pretty quickly. You know, it's not going to be a fine art project. It's not going to be a finished product. But if you're looking to composite something real quick for a test case scenario, right? And now in 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, I have put together this. And it, especially over here, it's pretty convincing. And it shows what it looks like if this city is with this lake. That juxtaposition, whatever it is we're wanting to juxtapose, right? So that is one of the reasons to use something like this. We can put stuff together pretty quickly. We can see how they look. The other thing that matters now is that this can always be brought back. I can always undo. I don't need to use the history brush and hope it works. I don't need to save in a certain manner. It's non-destructive. This image, the rest of that image, this here, is always there. Now, a couple other tricks we can use this for. So if we have layers, because we need to get used to our layers panel, if I right click on a layer, I can duplicate a layer. Now when I do that, you're going to see the edges change. They're going to get sharper because what's happening is those areas that were like, say, 50% opacity, they're now on top of each other. By the way, 50% opacity plus 50% opacity actually equals 75%. It's a wiggy math where it goes halfway in between the two, that and full opacity. But essentially it made the edges sharper. But what we're going to do actually is we're going to take that whole image. We have this layer selected, and we edit, and we say transform, and we can actually flip flip vertical, and it does that, right? So far, so good. But what we really want to do is blend it into the pond. Now, you could bring the opacity down. We could also use these things we learned in these last few weeks, these blend modes, that take into account what's going on behind it. And then also probably take down the opacity because most reflections are not that pristine. And then the other thing we can do is technically the center line between these two reflections is not centered. That was very bad of me. I moved it without holding down shift. There we go. And so we can kind of guide this so that it's setting up properly. And then if you really want to work with it, we can go edit, free transform. I'm going to move this anchor point up to where that line is between the reflections. I'm going to shrink that down a little bit, because the reality is a reflection is also not going to be perfectly scaled. I hit enter, and then I tinker. It's how much do I want this to be reflected? How much do I want to see any of these things going on here? And you can see how nicely they've blended together. So and actually, if I really wanted to get these trees to blend in together without this light stuff, I could actually separate the trees out from this layer and give them their own blend mode. Which one I would use, I'm not sure. I'd have to test it out. But basically, there's things you can do to make these things match a little bit better. All right. But this is how a layer mask works. It is a mask of that layer that makes it so you can change the opacity of that layer pixel by pixel. There's lots of different kinds of layer masks, or rather lots of different ways you can use a layer mask. One final thing actually. I have the brush, where'd it go? I have the eraser set to brush, and it's got really soft edges, and so it all comes out very, very fuzzy on the edges. But we also don't have to keep the brush at 100% opacity. I can bring down the opacity, and then nothing happens. Stand by. Because I've got the colors backwards. There we go. You have to make sure that it's erasing to black if you want to actually see some of the things that are underneath. There we go. So I can bring in some of that fancy, fancy sky that's in the other one. And because my brush is set to a fairly low opacity and is set to a really soft edge, basically this is as fluffy as you can make a brush. What that means is that I have a lot of control over which parts of the sky come through. And you won't see the brush edges. So it'll just kind of look natural, right? And now we have, instead of that harsh sky, we've got a little bit of cloud action going on, which is nice because that's actually what's being reflected in the pond, because in the original image it is like one of those lovely sky days. This might actually be a composite in and of itself, I'm not sure. That sky does not convince me. So you can blend the two together and still get that jet stream that's going through there, and still, because the edges are what we worry about with a composite, but the clouds are blending into other clouds on a cloudy day, so we don't have to worry about that necessarily. I'd say the only thing that's bugging me right now is the fact that it's much darker around this building, because getting the sky to blend in next to the building without taking away the building is a little bit harder. So I'd have to do a little bit of work to get that correct. That's the only place where I'd have to make it show up. Everywhere else, the two things blend together very nicely. All right, so most of this is using tricks that we've used before. Duplicating layers, using blend modes, changing the opacity, using free transform. It's just a combination of those things that makes a lovely composite image. And now in less than 15 minutes, I've put together something for my boss that shows what the city looks like if it's next to a pond, and it's also, because it's editable, all non-destructively, we can make whatever changes we want for our client, and make any image adjustments to the color and get lots of variations out to them right away.